A hatter's hands wouldn't stop shaking. In the mid-1800s, doctors in New Jersey examined felt workers whose fingers jerked so violently they could no longer lift a cup of tea. Their speech slurred, their memory failed. Some grew so anxious and fearful that they refused to leave their homes. On factory floors in towns like Danbury and Stockport, the same pattern appeared again and again. Rashes, trembling, confusion, and then a slow slide into what observers simply called madness. The one thing these workers had in common was their job. They were hatters, and all day long they stood in rooms filled with invisible mercury vapor. In the cramped workshops of 18th and 19th century Europe and North America, a revolution in fashion was unfolding. Gentlemen's hats, tall, elegant, made from beaver and rabbit fur, had become symbols of status and refinement. But producing the smooth, luxurious felt that made these hats so desirable required a secret ingredient, one that glowed a peculiar shade of orange in the dim factory light. The process was called carroting, named for the bright hue of the chemical solution brushed onto raw animal pelts. Mercury nitrate, dissolved in acid, was painted liberally across bundles of fur. The solution caused microscopic barbs on each hair to open and tangle together, transforming stiff, slippery pelts into soft, matted felt. Without this step, the fibers would not bond properly. Without mercury, there would be no high-quality felt. Inside the hat-making centers of Danbury in Connecticut, Stockport in England, and Luton's crowded factories, workers spent 10 to 12 hours a day bent over steaming vats. The air was thick with heat and vapor. Ventilation, if it existed at all, was often a single window cracked open in summer. In winter, even that was often sealed to keep the workspace warm. With every breath, men and women inhaled mercury. At first, the symptoms seemed minor. A hatter might notice a metallic taste lingering on the tongue, or a rash spreading across the forearms. Gums bled when they ate. Sleep became restless, broken by sweating and coughing fits. These complaints were easy to dismiss, blamed on bad diet, weak nerves, or alcohol. Factory owners certainly treated them that way. When a worker complained, he was told to toughen up or find work elsewhere. Months turned into years. The rash did not fade. The cough grew worse. A hatter's hands began to tremble when he reached for his tools. His handwriting, once neat, became an illegible scrawl. He struggled to remember simple instructions or his children's ages. At the dinner table, family members watched him fumble with cutlery, watched his face twitch and his jaw clench without reason. The tremors, nicknamed hatter's shakes in towns like Danbury, were the most visible sign. Hands quivered so violently that workers could no longer shape felt or trim brims. Some developed a jerking gait, as if their legs no longer obeyed. Others slurred their speech or forgot entire conversations. Employers quietly rotated these men out, replacing them with fresh workers who had not yet begun to shake. But the damage went deeper than muscle control. Mercury vapor doesn't just attack nerves in the hands and feet, it crosses into the brain. Hatters became irritable, anxious, prone to sudden outbursts of rage or tears. They suffered hallucinations, shadows moving in the corner of the room, voices whispering accusations. Some became paranoid, convinced co-workers were plotting against them, or that family members were poisoning their food. Others withdrew entirely, unable to hold a conversation or recognize how much they had changed. In the 19th century, English speakers began using a curious phrase, "mad as a hatter." The saying appeared in letters, newspapers, and casual conversation. Most assumed it was simply a colorful idiom, perhaps referring to an eccentric tradesman or a folk character. Few understood that it described a real, widespread medical condition affecting workers across 2 continents. In 1860, Dr. J. Addison Freeman, a physician in New Jersey, published one of the first detailed medical accounts linking hatters' symptoms to mercury exposure. He described tremors, memory loss, emotional instability, and what he termed erethism, a cluster of psychological symptoms including shyness, irritability, and overwhelming fear. His paper drew a direct line between mercury nitrate and the carroting process and the madness observed in hatters. Factory owners dismissed these findings. Mercury, they argued, was essential. No alternative could produce felt of the same quality or at the same speed. If some workers fell ill, that was the cost of doing business. The symptoms, they said, could be caused by anything: alcohol, poor hygiene, weak constitution. It was cheaper to replace a sick hatter than to redesign a factory. The men and women who worked with Mercury had no unions at first, no safety regulations, and no compensation systems. When they became too ill to work, they were simply let go. Families lost income, reputations suffered. Neighbors whispered that the affected workers were drunkards, unstable, or cursed. The truth, that their bodies had been systematically poisoned by a standard industrial process, remained buried in medical journals and factory records. December 1st, 1941. In Danbury, Connecticut, the smell inside the hat factories was different. For decades, workers had stood above vats of orange solution, breathing mercury vapor until their hands shook and their minds frayed. On this day, those vats were being drained for the last time. Mercury nitrate, the chemical at the heart of the carroting process, had finally been banned from American hat making. In its place came new treatments, using hydrogen peroxide and hydrochloric acid. To a passerby, the change might have seemed technical. To the workers who had lived with the Danbury shakes, it felt like a quiet revolution. By the early 20th century, Danbury had earned its nickname, Hat City. More than 30 factories operated within the town limits, turning out millions of felt hats each year. Nearly every family had at least one member in the trade. Hat making shaped the skyline, the economy, and the health of the town. Inside these factories, conditions were harsh. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder in hot, humid rooms, dipping and brushing fur, shaping felt, trimming brims. The floor was slick with water, sweat, and chemicals. Windows stayed shut to maintain the right humidity for felting. Ventilation systems, where they existed, were rudimentary. Mercury vapor built up in the air, invisible but lethal. The pattern of illness became so common in Danbury that locals gave it a name: the Danbury Shakes. At first, it was almost a dark joke. Young workers watched older hatters spill coffee with trembling hands or struggle to sign their names. Over time, the joke faded. There were too many cases. The progression of symptoms in Danbury mirrored what doctors had described elsewhere. Early signs included rashes, excessive salivation, mouth sores, and a metallic taste. Then came the tremors, starting in the hands and spreading to the jaw and limbs. Memory deteriorated. Workers had trouble following instructions or recalling basic information. Emotional instability followed: outbursts of anger, sudden tears, crippling anxiety. In the most severe cases, hatters developed hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Some became convinced that co-workers were plotting against them, or that their families were poisoning their food. A number were committed to mental institutions, recorded not as victims of industrial poisoning, but as cases of insanity or dementia. By the 1930s, the pattern was too obvious to ignore. Researchers at the U.S. National Institutes of Health and the U.S. Public Health Service began systematically studying mercury exposure in hat factories. They measured mercury levels in the air, examined workers, and compared symptoms. Their findings confirmed what hatters already knew from bitter experience. The industry's standard process was poisoning its workforce. Still, change did not come immediately. Trade associations warned that abandoning mercury would ruin American hat making, making domestic felt uncompetitive against foreign imports. Some factory owners insisted that improved ventilation was enough, even as workers with decades of service developed crippling tremors and cognitive decline. Pressure built from multiple directions. Labor organizing grew stronger. Public health advocates pushed for reform. Journalists reported on the Danbury shakes and similar conditions in other hat-making regions. Medical evidence mounted in journals and government reports. Finally, in 1941, a nationwide agreement was reached. Under the guidance of the U.S. Public Health Service, major hat manufacturers agreed to eliminate mercury from the carroting process across 26 hat-producing states. On December 1st, the ban took effect. Hydrogen peroxide-based treatments replaced mercury nitrate. Production continued. Workers' exposure to mercury did not, and that alone justified the change. For many hatters, the ban came too late. The damage mercury had done to their bodies and brains could not be reversed. Tremors remained. Memory loss persisted. Kidneys and nervous systems were already compromised. Decades later, legal cases in other industries echoed what hatters had endured. In 1997, a British court awarded £1.3 million to 20 South African workers poisoned by mercury while employed at Thor Chemicals, a company that processed mercury waste. The case became a landmark in holding multinational corporations accountable for mercury poisoning, but it arrived long after the era of mercury-soaked hat factories had passed. In Danbury, some workers and their families informally marked December 1st as a turning point, the day a dangerous practice finally ended. But for thousands of hatters across generations, the victory was symbolic. The industry moved on. The tremors stayed. Mad as a hatter. The phrase appears in 19th century English sources with no explanation, tossed into diaries, newspapers, and conversation as if everyone knew what it meant. To most speakers, it was just a colorful way of calling someone eccentric or unhinged. In 1865, Lewis Carroll gave the expression a face. His Mad Hatter, trapped in an endless tea party in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, spoke in riddles and nonsense. Readers embraced the character as whimsical fiction. Only later did commentators begin to connect the dots between this Mad Hatter and a real trade associated with trembling hands and disturbed minds. Historians point out that the idiom mad as a hatter predates Carroll's book, and its exact origin is still debated. Some linguistic scholars argue that the phrase may have arisen independently of mercury poisoning, from other regional sayings. Others note that by the time it appears in print, mercury-based felt making was already well established, and hatters' shakes and behavioral changes were well known in industrial towns. What is clear is that while the phrase survived, the story behind it faded. For people in Danbury, Stockport, Luton, or New Jersey's hat-making districts, Mad Hatters were not fairy tale characters. They were neighbors whose hands jerked uncontrollably, who forgot familiar faces, who slipped into paranoia and fear after years in the trade. The ban on mercury in hat-making did not erase the phrase. It did, however, mark the beginning of a wider shift in how societies thought about industrial hazards. The same century that coined mad as a hatter also witnessed other toxic legacies: leaded paint and gasoline, asbestos in insulation, radium in consumer products. Each left its own trail of damaged bodies and legal battles. Hat-making itself declined as fashion changed. By the mid-20th century, formal felt hats were no longer a daily necessity for most men. Factories closed or converted to other products. Towns that had once depended on felt gradually redefined themselves. The occupational disease that had shaped a phrase outlived the job that made it common. Yet mercury did not vanish from the modern world. It remained in thermometers, fluorescent lamps, certain industrial processes, and, in some regions, artisanal gold mining. Its capacity to damage the nervous system continued to inform occupational safety standards, environmental regulations, and eventually international agreements like the 2013 Minamata Convention on Mercury, aimed at reducing global mercury emissions. Today, when someone says, mad as a hatter, they are usually not thinking about nitric acid, felt workshops, or erethism. The words float free of their history. But behind the idiom stands a real chapter of industrial life, one in which ordinary workers paid the price for fashionable hats, and a chemical that made fur behave. A perfect felt, a poisoned workforce, and a phrase that outlived the people it described.